in order to really like dive into some of this history and this understanding that we're growing in terms of counter-cartography and the variety of sites that we all will explore throughout the semester, it felt really important to start one with 135th Street as the first sort of location, avenue, street that we, Lenox of course, but just the 135th Street corridor as a place to start. Because I think that there's so much there. And as you'll see, most of the time is spent talking about both Marcus Garvey and the Universal Negro Improvement Association and the Schomburg Center. But I think it represents this larger internationalist history that I want to situate us in, that Harlem is at once a super hyper-local neighborhood, but it also reflects a Black diasporic sort of globalism and internationalist perspective that I want us to keep at the forefront of our minds when we continue on throughout this semester. And I was saying it before, I'm just gonna say it one more time, not to be annoying, but especially when I'm doing the lectures and if anyone else is speaking or presenting, I just ask that we keep our focus up here and like the clicky noise. It's very hard for me to concentrate. I'm not a good multitasker, and so I'm just being honest with y'all, so please help me stay focused with you, and so I just ask for your attention. And so yeah, I'm gonna take us through these slides and then we'll kind of discuss this, maybe what came up in the reading, like what we're thinking about, and we'll break and then we'll get into the graphics, and then we'll do lunch and walk over to 135th and have a conversation also with Maisel Cinema. And we figured we probably won't walk the whole corridor today because it's too much, and so we'll find time to do a second walk and do like 127th Street or 125th to 116th. I also want to mention that while the syllabus said we're going to talk about Lenox Terrace, we're not even getting to that today, so TBD. I'm going to try doing some tweaking like today or tomorrow, and then I'll send an email to y'all so you know like specifically what you need for next week, but I'm sorry. So yeah. This is a bit of a silly video. You'll hear the voiceover is a bit extreme, but I thought this is just a good place to start. How many of you all are familiar with Marcus Garvey or the UNIA? A little bit? What do you all know about this? And anything is fine, and then we'll like all dive into it together and kind of build a shared analysis. Like when you hear Marcus Garvey, what comes up? Jamaican. You said a little bit?
Like a little bit.
Just like the name sort of
I
rings a bell?
remember the name. Pretty sure he had like some properties. He was like a real community developer, but that's really all I know.
Okay. Yeah, actually community developer, yes, and a little bit familiar with the name. Yeah. Okay, cool. So we get to learn together. Hopefully this works, and the volume is gonna come from my computer.
Marcus Garvey, a Black nationalist and leader of the Pan-Africanism movement in the early 1900s, once said, "In death, I shall be a terror to the foes of Negro liberty." Elements of Garvey's beliefs and activism, which were embraced by millions of followers, were absorbed by several Black activist groups and movements, such as the Black Panther Party, Rastafarians, and the Nation of Islam, among others. Marcus Mosiah Garvey, who was born in Jamaica in 1887, grew up reading the books of his father's library. He left Jamaica at the age of 23 and traveled through Central and South America, working as a newspaper reporter and editor. In 1912, he moved to London and studied law at Birkbeck College. He also worked for a Pan-Africanism newspaper and led debates at the famed Speaker's Corner at Hyde Park. He toured other European cities, including Paris, Madrid, Bologna, and Monte Carlo. He returned to Jamaica in 1914, inspired by American educator and orator Booker T. Washington's autobiography, Up from Slavery. Garvey founded the Universal Negro Improvement Association, or UNIA. The UNIA promoted Black economic empowerment, political equality, and the eventual liberation of Africa from European colonialism by way of a Black army. In 1916, Garvey moved to the United States. He settled in New York City and started a UNIA branch in Harlem. He quickly gained a large following, and so did the UNIA, especially after the Red Summer of 1919, one of the deadliest eras of race riots and lynchings in the United States. White mob violence resulted in the killing of hundreds of black men, women, and children. Black World War I veterans who endured violence and bigotry that year after returning home from Europe were a large, receptive audience for the UNIA. The organization grew to 700 branches with more than 2 million members worldwide. Garvey and his associates held a large UNIA convention in Madison Square Garden, where they introduced the world to the Pan-African flag. Red stood for the blood shed by Africans. Black represented the people of African descent, and green stood for Africa's natural fertility and growth. Garvey also launched the Negro Factories Corporation and opened a chain of restaurants and hotels, urging Africans to buy black. His newspaper, Negro World, had a circulation of more than 200,000 on 4 continents and was published in English, Spanish, and French. He and his associates also established the Black Star Line Steamship Company. The BSL purchased 3 ships in hopes of beginning an African redemption program to Liberia. They wanted to establish a nation in the West African country for those who were born into slavery or were the descendants of enslaved people. But many believe Garvey's downfall began when he decided to meet with the leader of the Ku Klux Klan, Edward Young Clark, in 1922. Garvey actually shared the segregationist views of the Klan, as he sought a separate state for those of the African diaspora. He actually said, quote, "I regard the Klan, the Anglo-Saxon clubs, and white American societies, as far as the Negro is concerned, as better friends of the race than all other groups of hypocritical whites put together."
Okay. A wild place to end, but we're going to end there. So I thought it was important to just sort of situate this history of Marcus Garvey, because he is so integral to what we understand Speaker Corner to be, which is 135th Street. It made a lot of sense. It's a 2-way corridor, and Marcus Garvey gave his founding speech establishing the Universal Negro Improvement Association in 1916 on 135th Street. So we'll go here, and you said that Marcus Garvey real estate kind of enterprise, and that's not initially what would come to my mind when thinking about Marcus Garvey, but part of the many things he did, and of course we see this as a complicated figure. It was a super boiled down video, a little bit silly with the the voiceover, but Marcus Garvey was super important because in many ways he reflected the first sort of internationalist nation-building political project of a post-emancipatory Black United States and Black global anti-colonial vision. And so for him, part of that vision meant owning property. And we can see UNIA owned spaces along 135th Street, along Lenox Avenue, and sort of other places in and around the neighborhood. So from 1918 to 1927, the Universal Negro Improvement Association was headquartered in Harlem. The organization generally appears in accounts of Harlem on the parade. You'll see some famous photos. I think we had one in our PowerPoint last week of this fancy black parade, turn of the century outfits, and folks gathering. And that's a lot of how he built his constituency. So its headquarters were on 135th Street, and maybe we'll walk it in a few weeks, and this is where Lenox Terrace now is. And they had many organizations, and Liberty Hall was the site of weekly meetings and an annual convention, and this was on West 138th Street. And of course, as we see, the UNIA owned and operated a range of businesses. And so this, really reflects a new political vision for Black America and for Harlem post this, white flight that we see happening around 1915. I also just want to mention, and this is not in the slides, and we'll talk, for me, Malcolm X is a really important figure. It's how I understand Black spatial practices across Harlem. And for example, Malcolm X grew up in a Garveyite household. This meant his parents, his mother, who was Grenadian, his father was from the South. They were both active members in the Universal Negro Improvement Association, and that's how they met. And so oftentimes people think of a figure of like Malcolm X as having evolved into this sort of internationalist perspective, when really he was born into an internationalist, deeply political household, and his father was killed by Klan-adjacent members because he was a landowning Black person in the 1920s, because he was a leader in this movement. And we'll see, for example, Mount Morris Park was renamed Marcus Garvey Park, and I think that a lot of our understanding of Lenox Avenue, of sort of the political imagination of this corridor, has its roots in Marcus Garvey's legacy. And that's also how Speaker Box Corner comes to be understood as a site of Black radical politicking. So this is just another view, another map that sort of shows us where these moments of political convergence were happening in Harlem, particularly in the early 1900s, 1920s, up to the 1930s. So for example, the first sort of Black socialists who were converging around this global political vision of an anti-colonial African diaspora were meeting on these spots, and even up until the 1930s, people could be found as far as 115th Street all the way up to sort of 135th. We can see the park, and I guess this is kind of where CCNY is. So I just wanted to ground our discussion. It felt important to start with Marcus Garvey, because that is sort of like, if there, we are to like rethink this like spatial understanding of architecture along Lenox Avenue, it's really important that we understand an internationalist politic. And when I say internationalism, I mean that like the political vision of a unified Black diaspora necessarily includes not just folks in the United States, not just folks here in Harlem, but folks also across the continent who are struggling under imperialism, struggling under, for example, British colonialism. Marcus Garvey was Jamaican, and so he's thinking about British imperialism in Jamaica. He's trying to, take enslaved folks who were born into slavery, or families whose parents were, for example, enslaved, and say, let's go build a new free political experiment on the continent, which, for him was Liberia. It's interesting, my family is actually part Liberian, and there's a whole set of complicated relations between folks who migrated to Liberia from the United States, who were freed enslaved people, and then indigenous Liberians, which my family are, and a whole new set of complicated politics. But that's another conversation for another day. So that's Speaker Corner, that's sort of like the political undertone of 135th Street, and I'm really curious, like in our new kind of like renderings and reimagining of what 135th Street might look like, particularly these empty lots that we'll see that were just burned down in front of Lenox Terrace, how might we like look to this history to sort of revision spaces that recall this political imagination. And this is a map that I hope we can do a bit more work from. I think it was like 1940s, maybe 1940 exactly. Obviously this is before 1940, but this wonderful like project was done where all of the dots were essentially photographed across New York City, and so it's sort of like a Google Maps, but all turn of the century through 1940 images. And this is the northwest corner of 135th Street. You can see the subway line has been put in, and this corner is now where the Schomburg Center stands. And so this kind of helps to situate the conversation we're gonna have around the Schomburg. Oh, I also, excuse me, see I'm already not looking at my notes. One of the other things I wanted to say, just really lastly, about the political imagination of this Black internationalist project and the UNIA and people like Malcolm X, who also gave a lot of important speeches, including many, many, many other Black political leaders, Black organizers at the time. Like, we think about United States history, and this is maybe stuff we've learned. I know we have folks also not from this country, and so that all of this may be new in some sense, which is fine. But we learned about like World War I, we learned about the League of Nations. All of this is happening in the same time. This is all like the same 10-year time. And so I think there's something really important to understand about space making from like 1915 to 1930 that was really centered around a nation building project. You have the League of Nations, World War I, all of those things are happening, this colonial rearrangement of Western space through imperial domination. But counter to that, you have Black folks who are fleeing the South because of racial violence, because of lynching, and they're establishing, for example, the UNIA, which is this globalist vision, or similarly and dissimilarly, for example, the Nation of Islam, which Malcolm, grew out of in many ways, was established in this time. And I also see the Nation of Islam as quite literally a nation-building project. It suggests that folks who are being crushed under the weight of empire, crushed under the weight of structural racism, are trying to build their own space. And so a lot of how Black Harlem emerges post-white flight is very much rooted in this understanding of a nation-building project that is in many ways autonomous from this, larger systems and structures that dominated Manhattan, downtown, and other parts of the Northeast, and just the United States in general. And so what does it mean to understand Harlem through this lens of a Black nationalist nation-building project in this time that also in many ways is reflective of just the general political trend of the 20s, which was really, I think, committed to this question and this, global rearrangement of power and placemaking. And so what sort of cartography might we map onto this political history? Okay, so we think about 135th Street, and now I want to draw us to, we saw where what used to be where the Schomburg now is, and I just want to also situate us. A lot of this conversation is going to be history, but I think it's important to really deeply understand this history, to deeply understand the mapping, the architectural renderings that we'll be doing of this site, and also to see these figures, what they looked like, who they were, also, for example, Arturo Schomburg, who we're learning about. He was also not born in Harlem. He's Afro-Boricuan. He's from Puerto Rico. And so you can read what's here, and I have a little bit more written down. So Arturo Schomburg was born in Puerto Rico in 1874. His mother was a Black woman originally from St. Croix, and his father was a Puerto Rican of German heritage also. He attended San Juan's Instituto Popular, where he learned commercial printing, and then also St. Thomas College in the Virgin Islands, where he studied Negro literature. And so, again, it's important to note that both of these figures were well-educated Black folks at a time where Black people didn't have access to education in the same way we do now, but also that their education wasn't even happening here in the United States. He was a self-proclaimed Afro-Boricuan, which was really to assert his Black identity, and I think that's important to just recognize and honor the way that he named himself. And he was deeply, deeply committed to studying and pursuing African history, especially after a teacher told him, quote, "Negroes have no history, no heroes, or great moments." And this is similar to something Malcolm X experiences when he's in school. Someone tells him, he tells a teacher, "I want to be a lawyer," and he's like, "No, Negroes aren't lawyers, you can be a carpenter." And so these are deeply radicalizing moments for people like Schomburg and Malcolm X. And so I think this is part of the moment that set Schomburg on his path of being a bibliophile, a collector, a writer, and someone deeply invested also in this global internationalist vision of Black liberation. In 1891, Schomburg migrated to New York City, specifically Harlem, where he became involved in the Harlem Renaissance, the independence movements for Cuba and Puerto Rico, and he was a member of the Revolutionary Committee of Puerto Rico, which was a group of Cubans and Puerto Ricans who sought independence from Spain. He was a secretary of Las Dos Antillas, an organization that worked for the independence of both of these countries. And a year later, he became a Mason with El Sol de Cuba, 38, a Spanish-speaking lodge, which was comprised of both Cuban and Puerto Rican folks, immigrants particularly. But disillusioned by the lack of progress towards an independent Cuba in Puerto Rico, Schomburg changed the Masonic group's name to Prince Hall Lodge, honoring the first U.S. Black Freemasons. So this is part of how he is politicized in Harlem in the United States, while also this deep attention to his homeland and to the Hispanophone Caribbean. And in 1904, Schomburg's first known article is Haiti Decadent. It was published in the Unique Advertiser. He also published and co-published a range of articles, including in the Encyclopedia of the Colored Race a year later. And in 1913, he spoke to a group of Black educators at Cheyney University in Westchester, Pennsylvania, which is an HBCU. And he really promoted this idea of Black history as part and parcel of U.S. education. And he also wrote, for example, for the Crisis magazine, which was the official magazine of the NAACP, the National Association for Colored People. And so all of this helps us contextualize Arturo Schomburg becoming one of the largest collectors of African and African American history, which was then purchased by the Carnegie Corporation and given to and sort of established by the New York Public Library, particularly the 135th Street branch in 1926. And following his death, it was renamed after Arturo Schomburg, known as the Schomburg Collection of Negro Literature, History, and Prints. And today it's still one of the largest, if not the largest, collection, and it's grown to include other pieces beyond his own, but of Black history, Black literature. The Malcolm X archive is housed at the Schomburg. The James Baldwin archive is housed at the Schomburg, as well as a range of other really, really important archives, literally down the street from us. Okay, so now that is like the context of who Schomburg was, and that moves us to, I think, honestly, for this conversation, really the main site that I want us to focus on. So built the New York Public Library with a lot of money from the Carnegie family and the Carnegie Corporation. It's one of 65 libraries that they established. It was built in 1905 on 135th Street. And it's important to remember that at this time, Harlem was still this wealthy upper middle class enclave. It was like the weekender space for white folks to go to, and so there was still sort of this like projected vision that Harlem would be this, you know, super wealthy, super fabulous place for people to come. And I forget who sort of spoke about Philip Payton, but I think that's a really important point because, and I was doing a little bit more research, and maybe y'all know as well, and we can talk about this, but with the proposed expansion of the subway, the 2-3 Lenox Avenue subway line up to Harlem, there was a major preemptive real estate boom that ultimately crashed between 1904 and 1905. And then this Black businessman, Philip Payton, founded the Afro-American Realty Company, which during its short life played a major role in Harlem's development as a Black community. In the aftermath of the real estate collapse, which produced this surplus in housing, Payton acquired a 5-year lease on white-owned properties and rented them, of course, at this super high rate to Black families. And also what I found really interesting, so all of these Black families were displaced at this time who initially migrated to this Hell's Kitchen area, between Hell's Kitchen and 34th Street, because of the opening of Penn Station, which was designed by McKim, Mead, and White, who also designed the 135th Street branch and a number of other branches. And as you can see, I think it's important to note that like part of their work and their centrality in US history was asserting like this worldliness and this understanding of a US architecture as being able to be kind of on par with European worldliness. And this is like still the United States is a super new country, and so I'm very curious the conversations we might be able to have around like what does this architecture of early like 20th century have to say about United States projecting a certain imaginary, a certain power, and we can see that in the original 135th Street branch. So this is an interesting photo because I don't know exactly when it was taken. Maybe this is like 70s, 60s, 80s, who knows quite when it was. But we see the economic disinvestment of Harlem, of New York Public Library, post-white flight, deep redlinings happening, all of the just absolutely nothing has happened with this building. And so it's like this stark contrast of what Harlem once was and what it was projected to be, but because of this real estate crash, it turns into this. And this is how the 135th Street branch looked for decades. And so yeah, I just wanted to draw our attention to the limestone facade, and this is what the material reality of economic disinvestment looked like at this time. And also one of the things I was thinking of when I was looking at this image, and I want us to like talk about and we can think a lot about when we go to Lenox Avenue and we do these walks, but like, there's a dirtiness and a grittiness to Harlem, but I think part of that is, because there's an understanding that disenfranchised folks don't own property in the community, they don't have an ownership over community, that there's no real impulse to take care or to preserve the physical infrastructure of a place like Harlem. And I'm not saying that this is a ubiquitous feeling for every single person that lives in the neighborhood or who lives in a disenfranchised place, but when there's a lack of ownership, there's a lack of incentive for both community members, well not both, but particularly for community members to be like, I'm gonna go and scrub this off of the building, or I'm not gonna do this. And that's part of, I think, this reality of structural inequity and structural racism. And so when we say like, why is a place like Harlem so dirty? One, it's because of policy-driven like disinvestment and like, for example, the city of New York taking away trash cans along 135th Street, but it's also this real deep feeling of like a lack of ownership over a community. And so all of these things are coalescing in this way. And so that is why I just wanted to point us to this image of what the library was and then what it kind of devolved into. And so now, 1991-ish, this photo was taken, but the Schomburg Center was established, and this, also calls us to the work of Max Bond. Are y'all familiar? There's a Max Bond Center here, but does anyone want to like shout out what they know about Max Bond? What comes to mind when you think of Max Bond? J. Max Bond? Donovan or Jerome also? Like a quick little, and then we'll do a little bit on Max Bond.
I want to hear that from a student.
And it's also okay, do folks not know who Max Bond is? Or not know about the history? I think that's important to note that we don't know. Oh, we know something.
Yeah.
What do we know?
He was a local architect, and I think the president of Spitzer, right? Or of Columbia.
GSAP? Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And yeah, so a lot of work around here, and it's part of partner of Davis Brody Bond.
Mm-hmm.
Anyone else? Oh, keep going, Luke.
That's what I got.
Not bad. Anyone else? Fast facts. Anything?
So I would love to hear what y'all know as well and open this up, but I think we're learning, and so it's okay that we don't know right now, but it's also like this is part of like the deep structural gaps in the architectural field that we don't learn about. There's a Max Bond Center here. Like Max Bond was one of the most like famous Black architects in the United States, and did so much work to develop particularly cultural centers. He designed, not the original Studio Museum in Harlem building, but what has now since been torn down on 125th Street and 8th Avenue. He redesigned, for example, the Shabazz Center where I used to work, and in 1978 was retained to build this structure, which is now the Schomburg Center. And so he's also done so many other buildings and sites. Davis Brody Bond also did the 9/11 memorial, like those kind of like not wells, but what would you call them? What's the word? Fountain, well, something. So it's really, really important to United States architecture, and yes, is local, but is also a national figure. And I think it's so interesting, for example, that GSAP has no center named after their former dean and one of the most important architects. But so yeah, Max Bond was also, actually no, before we continue forward, what do y'all have to say about Max Bond?
I think you did a good job. It's important to learn about people like Max Bond. I think you'll pass a number of buildings in Harlem and New York and maybe not realize that those are designed by his firm or somehow influenced by his position as a very prominent African-American architect of sort of the second half of the 20th century. He, I believe, was involved in this organization called HARP, which was a sort of radical architecture collective in Harlem that was looking at housing and community sort of action. When we look at the Schomburg Center here, we'll maybe get into this, but he really became known for using brick as a material.
Yeah.
If we're talking about materials, and I learned from our colleague here at school, Sean Rickenbacker, who's the director of the Bond Center, why that is.
Yes, we're about to get into that right now.
Okay, so let's get
and
into
then
that.
add to that, because I'm also learning as I go, but yeah, Max Bond was really pulling from both this history of the surrounding neighborhood, and so we're not talking about this today, Jerome, but Lenox Terrace, the Riverton, other sites use this red brick, so he's both reflecting the facade and materiality of 135th Street. But, and this is from their website, for example, they say the main reading room and special collections are stacked octagonal drums that recall Southern African house forms. And West African wood is used for shelves and paneling, and the vigorously geometrical brick exterior responds to the neighborhood context and nods to the high proportion of masons among African American construction workers. Mm-hmm. And so this building, this modernist building, is also a reflection of a particular Black American reality.
Mm-hmm. And artisan class.
And artisan class in a lot of ways, which I think is just important to note. And the building, as we'll see, as you've seen, has since changed. There's been an extension that we will see in the next slide. But this is Max Bond, because it's important to know who he was, what he looked like, and to sort of honor the architectural and cultural history that he helped to form, both in Harlem and beyond. Also, the last thing I do want to say about Max Bond, he served on the Architects Renewal Committee in Harlem from 1967 to 68, and on the New York City Planning Commission from 1980 to 1988. And so he did a lot. He also, for example, built the Birmingham Civil Rights Institute of Alabama, and so there's something to be said about his architectural practice, like embedding and like offering a materiality to Black social movement history and cultural history between the 60s and 80s. That's commemorating the civil rights, post-Black Power era, when finally it was deemed as something worthy of memorializing. And so this is another image of the 1991 reading room, super old school, modern. I love it. It looks different now, but I wanted to offer that visual so we could see what was happening in the Schomburg. And this is a rendering, a floor plan of the first floor. You can see stage, they have this lobby, the lobby, and then, yeah, this is just interesting photo. Maybe we'll be able to, or excuse me, floor plan, maybe we'll be able to go in at some point so y'all can get a better sense of this space, but I wanted to offer that as another visual. And I thought this was a really beautiful photo of Amiri Baraka, incredible poet of the Black arts movement. His son, Raz Baraka, is the mayor of Newark, and his daughter, Kelly Jones, is the chair of African American Studies at Columbia University, and also is an art historian, and of course the late great Maya Angelou, and they're dancing on the ashes of the late Langston Hughes in the Schomburg, who's interred right under this lobby area. And so, wow, like what a poetic and beautiful moment. And so again, that's part of this history that we're exploring. That's part of this 135th Street corridor. And I think it's so perfect that Spitzer itself is on 135th Street. So this is very much our community and the history. And then this is images from Marble Fairbanks architect, and they were the ones who in 2015, I don't know when they were retained, but major renovation to the Schomburg Center happened between 2015 and 2018 to modernize, expand gallery space, and then also the collections rooms where people do research, and then they also have a gift shop. And then there's this courtyard that connects the new building with the original 1905 New York Public Library structure. And then we can sort of see Harlem Hospital, and it's a shame, I barely talk about Harlem Hospital, maybe because it's so ugly, but I just became really interested and fascinated in this history of the Schomburg and sort of how it reflects this internationalist perspective that we were talking about earlier, particularly with the UNIA. But you know, the history is like first Arturo Schomburg. Before then, we have Marcus Garvey, or around the same time, speaking, lending their collections to these spaces, and then we see Max Bond in his firm expand and reimagine this history. And so, yeah, I really wanted us to get a sense of this space. This is another image of what it currently looks like. You can see Arturo Schomburg right there. You can see the New York Public Library, sort of. And then next, I just briefly want to call our attention to the history of Harlem Hospital. So this was the original Harlem Hospital on 135th Street and Lenox Avenue. Built in 1903, has since been torn down, and there's a couple new structures going up, and there's also an original structure, actually not sure, it may have been torn down, but on 137th Street between Lenox and Fifth Avenue, that sort of reflects this historical moment. But now you have this ugly building that was done in 1969, and actually totally unrelated to what we're talking about, but my great-great-grandmother was killed outside of here in a car accident, and I live on 135th Street, and so this is a really important space for me, and so in thinking about this conversation, I'm also like embedding myself in this social location and my own family's history in this space. I have family members that were born at Harlem Hospital, and also like had their life ended outside of this space. And so there's a lot happening, and I didn't even feel like there was enough time to really get into the whole bit around Lenox Terrace. And so there's one image that I'll include, but there was an expansion of Harlem Hospital in 2012. And you can see the murals. There's these gorgeous murals that were done on this new building, and this part of the building is really closer to 136th Street, and so it spans the whole 135th to 136th Street corridor, and again it reflects a particular African American history and artisan moment that was happening in the 20s and 30s. I thought it was really beautiful. And then lastly, I just wanted to include this image of Lenox Terrace, and we'll talk more about it. But the reason I wanted to include this image of Lenox Terrace, because Lenox Terrace was, I think, it opened in like 1957 maybe, I could be wrong, don't quote me. But the buildings were built in response to this new class of Black doctors and medical professionals who were responding to Harlem Hospital, responding to this like deeply intellectual moment that's also situated through the Schomburg, and weren't able to move downtown to doorman middle class buildings. And so the Lenox Terrace was the first set of doorman buildings for this burgeoning Black middle class, this Black bourgeois class, many of whom worked at Harlem Hospital. And so, and we'll talk about the development of it, both who lived there, there's really rich history, sort of it's, you know, the ways that it was also experienced a deep form of economic disinvestment by Olin Corporation, who manages and owns the properties, and then also this sort of reimagining that's happening of Lenox Terrace and the ways that community members have engaged. So I wanna stop there. And sort of have a conversation about this history, and I know most of it has been this sort of internationalist, global perspective of diaspora converging on Speaker Corner turned Malcolm X Boulevard. But yeah, that feels like the place that we can start, and then with this grounding, with this historic understanding, we might be able to better move along the corridor, and then when we get to a place like 125th Street and we're focusing on a very particular building, or we're learning about this moment at Lenox Lounge, and all of the folks who came here one night were like, okay, we can also situate it in this political, historical context that sort of started in this moment, early 1900s, along 135th Street. So that is where I'll stop. I'm very curious, like maybe initial thoughts that are coming to mind, and we can sort of just go there, and I don't know if anything also is reflected in the reading that we did, and maybe we'll come back to that a bit more as well, particularly when we talk about like the bodega, the smoke shop, and the sort of moment of late stage racial capitalism along one Lenox Avenue. But yeah, I'm curious, like thoughts, feelings, questions, clarifications that you might want or are thinking through right now.
How do we even frame or situate this place and this site? And I'm fascinated at you kind of as this interlocutor who also has lived a life in close proximity to these buildings, these sort of pieces of architecture, and how that kind of anecdotal psychogeographic experience begins to contribute to a reading of place.
Right.
And I think that's a kind of capacity that is at stake in this studio, and I would say in any endeavor to change the built environment, is to understand that people, yes, there is this sort of capital H history, and that's super important, and how that also impacts one's sort of personal embodied relationship and maybe one's own autobiographical or psychogeographic relationship to a place, right? Like it might exist in fragments, in memories of family members that you're talking about with Harlem Hospital. So I think that's really fascinating, and I'm interested to see how this continues as we go down the corridor with these different sites.
I'm also curious, like, what folks know, or like how y'all are processing this question or this perspective on internationalism. Like, is it new? Is, you know, the UNIA, like, how you're understanding that, or just more questions that you have? Yeah.
So we talk about a lot of things like Marcus Garvey and his movement, and then when it comes to a national building project, what does it mean? I mean, in terms of Islam, how it started, and I'm really confused about this word, national building project.
Nation building project? Yeah. So when I say nation building project, I'm not saying these folks were actually building like countries. Well, in a sense, Marcus Garvey was interested in establishing like a sovereign state, emancipatory state in West Africa, but I'm using it more loosely to describe this political project that was seeking to exist beyond, at least in the case of Black Americans, exist beyond the United States as an imperial project, sort of cosplaying as a democracy. And, you know, even when we talk about like World War I and this rearrangement of the Western Hemisphere, and the creation of the League of Nations turned United Nations, like there's this deep attention to how do we exist in this sort of geography that has been superimposed by colonialism, like, you know, Africa or all of these spaces. They were very differently, they were understood very differently than they now are. It wasn't Liberia and Ghana and Nigeria, it was Yoruba land, and it was the Ashanti and the, you know, Yoruba people and the Akan people. It was all very different. And so part of what I'm interested in talking about is that for many Black folks in the United States, the response to lynching, the response to structural racism and inequity, this is like not even 100 years after slavery has ended, is to say we're gonna build our own sovereign space that allows us to exist in some sense unfettered by a deep form of structural violence. So that means we're creating our own religious doctrine, in the case of the Nation of Islam, that and is in many ways like a bastardization of Sunni Islam, but that helps to make sense of the violence of structural white supremacy, and that also allows for them to build businesses and autonomous communities, to build homes, to build their own architectural lexicon that allows them to exist beyond white supremacy. And I think the Universal Negro Improvement Association was also similarly a project that would allow Black folks both in the United States but also beyond the United States to come together. And so, and that's happening, but it's also happening at the same time that the Western world is doing something different, but with a different political aim. One that is committed to imperialism, committed to a type of neo-colonialism that still doesn't allow an autonomy and a sovereignty for Black folks, but this is really a project of sovereignty. And so when we talk about, for example, gentrification and questions of land sovereignty, part of the sovereignty that, you know, we talk about, that this neoclassical architecture was so important in asserting the United States as its own nation-building project, and also asserting it in Harlem, when Harlem was understood as a very different space. Like, if we walk uptown 50 blocks, 20 blocks or less, we see all of these incredible, like Boricua College was built to be these, you know, they thought that like the Metropolitan Museum and all of these really important spaces were gonna be uptown. But that's when uptown was built for very different people. And then the minute white flight happened and the minute policy-driven economic disinvestment took hold of these communities, they said, actually, this nation-building process, this attention to neoclassical, like Beaux Arts architecture, no longer is relevant. And so then we see these facades crumble, and we see like also the neighborhood change, and it's so interesting how this architecture at once represents this moment and then within the span of 15, 20, 30 years is completely disregarded when the neighborhood and its racial demographic shifts. And so it's also tracking these moments of change and who is coming, who is leaving, why are they coming, why are they leaving. And I think it's so interesting that, you know, the same folks who built Penn Station built the 135th Street branch, but because Penn Station was built and all these Black folks were displaced, they came uptown. And so it's like, you know, it's really, really interesting. So thank you for asking for a bit more clarity and specification. And I think as we go throughout the semester, we'll continue to expound on this question of nation building, and we can sort of get at what our understanding of that is. Other thoughts? Questions? Clarifications? Does this feel really new for folks? I'm also just curious in terms of like what y'all are rooted in terms of like your academic work, because I'm an interlocutor into the space that I don't know.
I think that the way that you are talking about nation building, many of the people that you've talked about are probably inspired by the imminent collapse of the European empires at the time, with World War I.
Right.
The Germans collapsed, Austria-Hungary was divided into multiple nations, and just a century before, Italy and Germany formed from multiple different states and peoples, and they came together, and Puerto Rico and Cuba are just fragments that separated later from a collapsing Spanish Empire. I think
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Such a good point.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Yeah, I think so. There's this sense and this feeling, especially as someone who's lived there, that there's nothing cozy. Like energetically, it's actually quite terrible now. I hate it in a lot of ways. I really do. But there's this really interesting history. And then there's this, and we'll talk about it more, but like I'm super interested in like these post-war brick buildings because they're ginormous and the apartments are huge, which is why I moved there. Because I have like a nearly 800 square foot 1-bedroom apartment that you can't find anywhere else in the city. Or you can find some of them and they're far more affordable, but they're also interesting. Like Miles Davis lived in that building, Ella Baker lived in that building, Charles Rangel lives next door. There's this interesting kind of history of Black artists, Black politicians living in Lenox Terrace, but the way that the community has experienced a deep and vapid type of disinvestment is so incredibly evident. But in reality, we learned that 135th Street is one of the most important historic sites in Harlem, in New York City, in the country, really, when we think about it. Because Black history is US history, is global history. And so when we look at those vacant lots that were just burned down 2.5 years ago, 3 years ago, fairly recently, and they will be redeveloped, so you know, that is in place, but it's like they were burned down on purpose. The Lenox Terrace office used to be there, but like even if we're to do our own speculative work of what might we put in that lot that's super big, that clearly is going to be redeveloped, how do we recall this history and this political imagination to help us understand what redevelopment could and should look like in a way that allows us to sort of like engage in a sort of architectural temporality that bridges time and space, but also responds to the material and political needs of a community who continues to experience a type of design destitute. So maybe we'll stop there.